This week on The Futurists, Jeff Speck.
Our physical world is the stage on which we enact our lives, and it can be either supportive of effective and happy living or supportive of self-destructive and even economically destructive.
Hey there, welcome back to The Futurists. I'm Rob Tercek. I'm very happy to have you here. This week, I'm flying solo, and that is because my business partner and friend, Brett King, is once again working in Dubai, where we're setting up the world's largest gathering in person of futurists. We've been working on this for a long, long time. Brett's been putting a ton of effort in and working in Dubai on the ground to get this event organized. And that's all happening at the Jumeirah Beach Hotel in Dubai on the 22nd and 23rd of September. We certainly hope you can find us there and see us there and meet us there and meet the other futurists. You can find out more about that event at futuristevent.com. Now, this week, I'm going to actually do a blast from the past, an old friend, an acquaintance, a classmate of mine. But before I get there, I wanted to do an introduction by way of one of the other guests on our show. Longtime listeners know that I'm fond of a scientist, a biologist named Andrew Hessel, who's a longtime biohacker specializing in the field of synthetic biology. And that, of course, is the practice of reprogramming life at the cellular level. So naturally, to be provocative in my conversation with him, I asked him if he felt like he was exercising godlike powers as a biologist. And he had a very interesting response. It was not the response I expected. Andrew told me, we live in a world where every inch, every mile of the planet, everything that we touch, everything we consume, every place we go, everywhere we live, is designed by humans. And he said, look, we've been put on this planet with these skills, and we might as well start getting good at being stewards of the planet that we live in. Now, that was not the answer I expected to hear from a synthetic biologist, but that idea has stayed with me for years. And when I look at the world, I now see it a little bit differently because I realize that when I drive around the city, someone designed every one of the streets and intersections and crosswalks and traffic lights. They designed the buildings around me, the shopping malls, the apartment buildings, the universities and schools, the city buildings, and so forth. They also designed the regions around the cities and the roadways that connect them. And even those places that remain wild, for instance, our national parks and national forests, even those are there by design, and they're quietly groomed and managed, perhaps in an invisible way that we don't notice most of the time, but they are managed by the Forest Service and the Park Service. And this is true around the world. In fact, you can go to as far as you can imagine on the planet Earth, and you're going to encounter things that are designed and planned by human beings. So since that time that I had that conversation with Andrew Hessel, I really wanted to get someone on the show who is an expert in city planning and urban design. And just by total coincidence, a blast from the past, my college roommate from my freshman year in college, a zillion years ago at Williams College, reached out to me when he was visiting Los Angeles, and we got reacquainted after many, many years. And it turns out that he is the world's leading planner for cities in city planning and city design and transportation policy. His name's Jeff Speck, and I want to give him a very warm welcome to the Futurist Show. Jeff, welcome to the Futurist. It's such a pleasure to see you here. Thank you for making time from your beautiful place, your new place in New Hampshire.
Well, it's funny that you've gone into the past for your show about the future.
We tend to do that. You know, it's one way to look at the future is to look at trends and look at the past and you project
But
forward.
well, I found you kind of by accident. I mean, I've always been curious what you've been up to for the last decades and had a slight awareness, but I kind of found you by accident and your podcast online and started listening to it. And I have to say, I was not surprised that probably the most dynamic, articulate, and creative thinking person, not just from my freshman suite, but from my freshman class, or I should say my college class, was doing such exciting work. So glad you,
And that's
Rob,
awfully flattering. Hey,
you
Jeff,
still got it.
flattery will get you on the show as often
Yeah.
as you like. Thank you.
Well, you still got it. But I do have to correct you though. I'm not the world's leading planner. I'd like to think I'm among the people doing the most interesting work. But there's a lot of people doing this work.
Yes.
And I'm probably best known in the U.S. because I wrote this book called Walkable City.
Yeah.
It's actually in 8 or 9 languages now, but that's that's catapulted my reputation well above my ability.
Oh,
So
God. Oh, gosh. All
the
right.
other
Well, you're
thing,
very humble. That's great. You haven't lost that preppy charm. But Jeff, that
the
book's
other thing,
important. So, Walkable City was a turning
yeah,
point in your career, and I think we should
yeah.
take a second and talk a little bit about that book. Um, it's interesting when you write a book, you start out, you think you know the answer, and as you write, you probably discover that you have a lot more to learn. Right? The writing of the book is itself an educational process. Did you have that experience?
I would say the title became my future. The choice to define good city planning through the frame of walkability was something that fell into place, perhaps by accident.
Hmm.
And I found that once I made that decision, a bunch of other things happened that were very fortuitous. So people often, when I go someplace to lecture or plan, they presume that I'm all about walking, that I'm about, health and the various physical aspects of walking, and that I'm a huge walking fan. And like most people, maybe a little more than most people, I love to walk.
Hmm.
But it's really not about that. It was about coming to the realization that if you design cities with the goal of walkability, you just do much better urban planning. So it's become a way to frame good urban design, or what we professionals call best practices in urban design, in an effective way that allows us to work better. It also is the best way to sell good urban design.
Hmm.
What we do has been called many different things. At first, my mentors, Andres Dwani and Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk, they called it traditional town planning or neo-traditional town planning, with the focus not on tradition, but on kind of abolishing the half century of error in which we had replaced traditional planning with what had become conventional planning, essentially around the automobile,
Hmm.
and assuming that the automobile was not an instrument of freedom, but a prosthetic device that you need just to live your life. And that's the world that we've inherited, or to a degree participated in the second half of the 20th century. So they called it traditional town planning because it was going back to the original principles that created healthy, successful places. It then became known as the new urbanism because a book came out with that name that
That's right. Yes, I remember
highlighted
that
their
term.
work and the work of many others. And I joined their firm, DPZ, in 1993. And that was the year that we created the first Congress for the New Urbanism,
And,
which was attended by a couple hundred people. We now have about 1,200 people at our conferences every year. We've done
and
32
Jeff,
of them.
if I'm not wrong, the new urbanism, part of the concept there is about society. It's about the social aspect of the city, right? The new urbanism was designed to foster more social interaction, which was something they felt was lost in the era of the automobile.
In returning to design as the principal activity of planning,
Mhm.
as opposed to bean counting or zoning, right? In returning to design, it was an acknowledgement that our physical world is the stage on which we enact our lives, and it can be either supportive of effective and happy living, or supportive of self-destructive and even economically destructive choices. So the social underlies everything. A lot of people who do design work did not get a liberal arts education, and I think the field has suffered from that. The idea that we're always turning back to the larger principles of what's good for humans and what's good for society, I think underlies the new urbanist movement. I was saying the different names that have been applied to the work we do: neo-traditional, new urbanist. We can call it best practices in city planning or urban design. But by calling it walkability or walkable planning, we relate the material in a way that people really get it and they can really embrace it.
And
And
the
so what I've
benefit is
found is,
baked right into the name, right? Walkable. People
yeah,
know what that is versus new urbanism is a little vague, but it's subject to
e-
interpretation.
everyone likes, well, I joke that the neo-traditional turned off the liberals and new urbanism turned off the conservatives. But the walkable city, even people who love to drive, and I grew up loving cars and I still do love cars, uh, like to walk. Or love to walk, and it's so good for us.
Mhm.
And I haven't made it my effort to dig into all the wonderful thing that people have said about walking over the centuries. But there are so many wonderful quotes, from Nietzsche to Socrates.
Mm.
I think Nietzsche walked 6 hours a day, if I'm not mistaken.
It's
Um,
Samuel Johnson used to write about walking in the city of London, and would
mm.
extol the virtues of London. And you can still follow his footsteps on some of the old streets in the center of London. Yeah, you're quite right. And until the mid part of the century, really till the Second World War, cities were designed in such a way that you could walk across the city. And many European cities are still like that. They still retain at least some of those characteristics in the core, though they've grown much since then. American cities are different, right? The part of the expression of American dynamism was to expand, right? The expansiveness and this idea of freedom or liberation or ownership. These are important things for Americans. That was expressed as suburban living. So now I want you to draw a little contrast between a walkable city and a suburb, because this seems to be the tug of war of the 20th century.
What's really important to communicate is it isn't about city versus suburb, or city versus town, or suburb versus village, or hamlet versus metropolis. It's about neighborhood versus zoning. And maybe there's a
Oh,
better way to describe that. This is the first time I've said what you just heard,
no, but that's
but
good. Okay, I
but
wanted to ask you about
but
zoning, so go for it, please.
well, the modernist technique of city planning, which certainly did not debut, but was most prominently launched at the 1939 World's Fair as the City of Tomorrow, which was Norman Bel Geddes, who was an industrial designer working
Yeah.
for GM and others, who had no training whatsoever, even in architecture, let alone in city planning or urban design. He designed beautiful radios and ultimately cars.
Yeah.
And they put him in charge of creating this new city of the future. He picked up on the ideas that Le Corbusier, who you know rather well, I'm sure,
Mhm.
and his colleagues had come up with after the First World War in Europe, essentially saying that the healthiest and most efficient way to live your life, strangely, was to separate every use from every other use. And Norman Bel Geddes has this wonderful quote that was heralded at the World's Fair, which, by the way, every American either went to that or had a friend that went to that.
Yeah.
Millions and millions of Americans went to the 1939 World's Fair. The highlight of the fair was Futurama, was the GM exhibit.
We know it
And
well here.
yeah, and Bel Geddes said, essentially, I'm going to paraphrase, to improve the convenience and efficiency of daily life, each activity will be separated from every other activity and placed in its own zone.
So there's this
And
notion
that
of
was
like a really functional space, right? That was their emphasis.
but if you think about it, Rob, it makes absolutely no sense. The idea that you would split your life into these different parts, where you
Yep.
work, live, sleep, recreate, worship,
Yeah.
get educated, and
Get
that they would
moving,
be
comrade. Let's walk over to the food hall. You know.
yeah, and they would be actually disassociated at such distances, and then collected in such large quantities that walking no longer served a purpose. The equivalent of that in suburban planning was the idea of Euclidean zoning, based on the court case that the Supreme Court said to Euclid, Ohio, it was okay to separate commerce from housing, and that
Oh, I see where you're going. Oh, so the Belgetti's
yeah,
idea turned into zoning,
yeah.
where then the state would say this place is used for this, and this space is set aside for another function.
Well, those two ideas were bubbling up kind of at the same time. And the initial impulse, some would argue a different story that I'm going to tell you, but the initial impulse of zoning was to keep the pollution, keep the factories away
Yeah,
from the houses.
right, exactly. Or
Um,
a slaughterhouse or something that
yeah,
smelled badly.
the
And that was definitely
the rendering factory.
but that was definitely a fact, right? In the early 19th century, or
Yeah,
the 19th century, early 20th century, it was true. Workers' quarters were often adjacent to factories, and so people
yeah.
were exposed to the outputs from those factories and the noises and the smells and the sounds. And that is a
So,
true thing. That
yeah,
they called it slum dwelling, at the time.
right.
So then the progressive movement in the 20s wanted to kind of reform and upgrade and maybe give people a cleaner, better places to live, thinking that this would uplift society, I suppose. It's all well intentioned, but it's a little
Absolutely.
Orwellian in retrospect.
Well, people were choking on the soot from the dark satanic mills,
Yep.
and the planners said, "Hey, let's separate the housing from the factories," and lifespans increased immediately and dramatically. And my mentor Andres used to joke, the planners were hailed as heroes, and they've been trying to repeat that experience ever since. And so the idea that you now separate every use from every other use. And also, that's how we won World War II, in a sense, by classifying,
Yeah.
quantifying, and batching
That's
all the different resources that were going into the war, from production to deployment.
And
And
modern
so,
industrial policy is the same thing, right? You
yeah,
separate the functions in the factory, and then people can
yeah,
concentrate on doing one task again and again.
yeah.
Okay, so we
Well,
took
let
these
me answer
industrial
your,
concepts and applied them to society, but that didn't work out
yeah,
so well.
let me answer your question, which is that the neighborhood, which is
Mhm.
defined as being compact, diverse, and walkable. That is the definition of a neighborhood.
And that could be
Is the
inside of a city, that could be in a
Yeah,
hamlet, like you said, or a
yeah.
suburb. Like
Is
we don't have to
is
pit
the
those
way we used
concepts against each other.
That's the way we used to plan. And so you can have a suburban life like I had in Belmont, Massachusetts, a short bus ride from Harvard Square and a short walk from my dad's office in Belmont Center. Or that you had, if I remember correctly, in Shaker Heights, one of the wonderful 1920s suburbs that was planned in this Garden City movement. That was the initial reaction to the factories blighting housing areas prior to that. Um, and those are suburbs, but they're suburbs that were built around the 5 to 10 minute walk.
Yep.
The neighborhoods tend to be about a 5 minute walk from edge to center.
And they
They're
had public transportation that took you efficiently to downtown without need
Yeah,
for a car.
yeah. And the transportation systems, of course, mapped the development patterns across
Right.
the region. So you have the nodal development patterns that grew out of train stops being a certain distance apart, and you had the linear main streets, like, for example, Mass Ave, as it heads out of Harvard Square and keeps going into Arlington and Lexington. It's basically a collection of main streets because that's where the streetcar ran. And it
Hmm.
was only when the trains and streetcars were, largely abandoned, in many cases burned, and the automobile became this machine that actually made the entire landscape equivalent. All you had to do was lay down a thin strip of asphalt, and all of a sudden, a place is just as accessible as everything else. So this nodal form of development, which gave way very comfortably to mixed-use walkable places,
Hmm.
went away.
You mean like around the train station, even in a suburb, there would be some shops and some places to
Yeah,
meet, and a church or a synagogue or a temple where people could
yeah.
gather. And so there was a kind of central point, even if you were out on the periphery of the town in a suburb, it still had a neighborhood feel to it. But once
When we
the
designed,
automobile leveled everything, then you never
yeah,
needed a center. You could have decentered suburbs
yeah.
without a walkable part. There was no place to walk to. And frankly, no sidewalks. I always found this peculiar about the West Coast. Endless neighborhoods with no sidewalks. What was the point?
Well, we've designed neighborhoods with no sidewalks, but that's because the streets are so calm and narrow and comfortable that everyone just mixes. And even though there are cars in the streets, um, people are comfortable walking. However, the typical community we design does have sidewalks. It has trees between the street and the sidewalk to give shelter, comfort, cooling, uh, and protection from the automobile. It tends to have cars parked along the edges of the street. I always say, if people are driving on a street, if you have cars driving on a street, you should have cars parking on a street, because that calms the traffic, protects the sidewalk.
Hmm.
But more to your essential point, when we design new places in my firm, which is called Speck, we only do mixed use communities, unless it's so small that there isn't enough, of a footprint to have more than a few houses. But if it's got more than a few houses, we're finding a way to have
Hmm.
other stuff in there to capture the trips that otherwise would be driving out on the street and adding to the congestion that everyone complains about. And this whole NIMBY movement that I'm sure you're well aware of, that's been such an impediment to fixing the housing crisis in our country. It isn't because people don't want neighbors. People don't want neighbors' cars. The cars are the problem. People
Yeah.
are very happy to have new neighbors if they don't come with cars that gum up their parking and gum up their commute.
Oh, that's quite interesting. Now, Jeff, I spent some time looking at the Spec Dempsey website, and I found it quite enjoyable. And I recommend that our listeners take a look at your website because there are a number of use cases where you actually spell out exactly what problem you were setting out to design, solve, I should say, and the solutions that you came up with, and how those change things. In particular, I like the one about Kenmore Square because you gave a very nice narrated description of what that proposal consists of, and the goals and the proposed solution. And you have to take so many factors into account because you're considering it first from a pedestrian perspective, but second, there's a big traffic perspective that you have to consider. Rerouting that traffic then actually made the roads safer for bicycles, for instance. So there's a number of different factors. How do you go about doing this? Tell us about your methodology because you're often, I'm sure, confronted with kind of a hairball of a problem. Maybe there was zoning and maybe there were decisions made in the past, but society moves on, traffic is always increasing, density is always, increasing, and so the problem becomes very complex. So what is your methodology for like kind of undoing the hairball and coming up with the solution?
I've never had it described as a hairball before, but that's
I don't know what else to
about
call it.
right.
When I look at traffic in Los Angeles, I'm like, how would you solve this particular intersection?
Well, with Kenmore Square, unfortunately, you cite a project which is about 8 years in the making now, and still the city of Boston and many players would like to see it happen. It hasn't happened yet, but I love the plan. The To answer your question, it's always a political challenge we face.
Mhm.
Less so in places like Boston, but the typical place we work is like in Oklahoma City or a Cedar Rapids
I noticed.
or Carmel, Indiana.
Like down home America, little
Yeah,
towns across the country, Indiana,
yeah.
Oklahoma. I like that.
Where we began in Kenmore Square with an intersection that we were told by the previous mayoral administration could not handle fewer private motor vehicles than it did today. So, and that happens in so many places we work, where we begin, people hand us the problem set, and the problem set includes the requirement that we not create, to put it simply, that we not create congestion. So a lot of what we do is look at street networks. We never look at just the one street that we're potentially assigned. And we say, okay, what opportunities are there to, and this is just one type of project we do because obviously we're planning new towns and private developments as well. But the problem we're very often handed is how do we make this neighborhood or this piece of a neighborhood livable, vital, more successful? Oh, but you can't cause congestion. So the first argument that never works is the concept of induced demand, which you've probably heard of. Induced demand is the fact that in congested systems, the principal constraint to driving, actually, the only real constraint to driving is congestion. And therefore, congestion's a constant. So we go to cities and say, look, you could add 2 lanes. And in 4 years, the data show in 4 years, you'll be just as congested. You could take away 2 lanes, and in 4 years, you'll be just as congested because people adjust their behavior. And when you allow it to click in their brains that, oh my gosh, the only reason I'm not driving peak hour commute is because of the traffic, that if you ream out the roads to allow more traffic to flow, I will
More
change my
traffic.
behavior. And that is what happens in time after time. There's a very
It's
clear
true. It's true.
very
When they
clear.
expand the freeways here, within 2 years, the freeways are
Yeah.
jammed. In the inverse, we saw the Mayor Hidalgo in Paris
Yeah.
ripped out roadways and
Yeah.
replaced them with bike lanes. And this was highly controversial. People in the
Yeah.
suburbs went bananas. They were so angry about it. Same thing in Vancouver, where they took out some freeway overpasses and turned them into bicycle lanes. And now you've got these perfectly walkable,
Yeah.
peaceful cities, and they're green, like you said. And it's so nice to ride a bike, and it's so easy to park a bike. So it sort of changes the tenor of the town, and then you get that result instantly. Like now, that change in
Yeah.
Paris seems to be very popular, as far as I can tell.
And Carmageddon never comes. That's the big surprise.
Uh,
When the Embarcadero Freeway came down in San Francisco after the Loma Prieta earthquake, or when Big Bertha was doing the Seattle's version of the Big Dig and removing the Alaska Way, there were days when they actually shut the whole system, and there were not traffic problems because again, people adjust their behavior. But in any case, that argument is true. It's pure economics, and it's true of congested systems. Now, when you're working in a city that's not congested, people may be rightly concerned that by limiting lanes, you will create the congestion they don't have. But most
mhm.
cities have congestion, so that's where we start. And that argument is a loser. I love it. Folks, who like theoretical concepts, understand it, and kind of dig the logic behind it. But uh, the people in the room who get it, they may not get it when they leave the room, and there's a lot of people not in the room. And still, even liberal advocates like Pete Buttigieg say there are times when we need to widen roads to fight congestion, and that's simply not true. So we move on from induced demand, and we say, how can we create a system that actually system-wide still handles just as much traffic, but does so in a uh, um, or handles the amount of traffic you have. We find a lot of systems that, sure, certain streets are congested, but the systems overall are not congested, and so we're able to redistribute stuff. But the plan for Kenmore Square, which is very hard to describe just verbally, took just this massive intersection where streets were crossing in an X effectively, and did
And with
something.
multiple streets.
Yeah,
And like 3 lanes of traffic on each lane in each direction.
Yeah.
And for a pedestrian, you'd have to wait like 6 minutes to get across the street
Yeah.
because you could make it to the island, then you were stuck on an island in the middle of traffic. I mean, I've been there. A miserable experience for a pedestrian.
So it created a central plaza that functioned effectively like a roundabout, but it wasn't a roundabout in the sense that people were spinning through it, on the spin cycle. It created 3 separate intersections around a triangular plaza that has a building on it by my friend, the wonderful architect Jeannie Gang, which we want to see built. And therefore it distributed the traffic into these pieces and shortened the cycle at each light so that you could walk through it much better. Of course, it did what we do in all of our plans is when we can is to create bike lanes out of the street on the pavement edge, right? So you have the cars parked, you have the curb, you have a buffer zone, you have bike lanes, you have trees, and then you have the pedestrian zone. That's the ideal sidewalk. That's what we're building in Cambridge. People are building in Seattle. That's the new way to provide bike facilities, not in the street. It's a scheme that we hope to see built. A lot of our work, Rob, is street redesign, because the aspect which most American cities get wrong the most is the street redesign. A perfect example is Louisville, where we're doing a plan. We did a plan that is almost finished, which I have this amazing drawing. It shows the one-way scheme that was perpetrated upon Louisville in the 1950s, where they turned every single street except Broadway in their downtown into a one-way pair. Just every single street, east-west, north-south. This is even before the highway came and blew through their downtown.
Like a mini version of Manhattan.
And every one of those, though, went from being like two one lanes, a street made of 2 single lanes, one in each direction, to 2 to 4 lanes in one direction. And when there's that opportunity to jockey, when you have another lane that you're not in, and you're in the slower lane, and you wish you were in the faster lane, you just jockey like mad. You become a very dangerous driver. And so, at least men do. So the condition in Louisville is you have a downtown which is walkable except for its streets. Not to get too much into detail, but my general theory of walkability, which is the structure of walkable city, and almost all my lectures and everything I do, says that to be walkable, if a place is going to be walkable, walking has to be useful, safe, comfortable, and interesting. And the condition you have in most of America's downtowns is that they're eminently useful and pretty comfortable and darn interesting, particularly Louisville, right? But they're not safe. And that's a much longer conversation we could have about how the American engineering profession, which, by the way, is reforming itself and deserves congratulations, but the American street design or street engineering profession began, and for the majority of its life has been based on a completely faulty premise regarding safety. And that premise is that forgiveness is what creates safety. And that's elbow room. And that's distinct from the European approach. In Europe, they have Vision Zero. Vision Zero, we're trying to achieve 0 pedestrian traffic deaths every year. And they're doing it. Oslo, 0. Helsinki, 0. The typical American city has dozens, if not hundreds. And the strategy of Vision Zero is you create the street system that causes people to drive the speed that you want them to go, right? American street design grew out of highway engineering. Now, think about how you set your speed.
Maximum efficiency, maximum throughput, getting people on the freeways as fast as possible.
But maximum safety, but on a highway. think about how you set your, because the principal determinant of violence and injury and death in a car crash is speed.
Speed.
Now, on a highway, think about how you set your speed on a highway. If you're like me, you look for the speed limit, you set your cruise control for 9 miles an hour over the speed limit, right? So your speed is based on the speed limit. If your speed is based on the speed limit, then anything you can do to add forgiveness to the system, wider lanes, fewer intersections, no parking, no trees, they're called FHOs, fixed and hazardous objects, big, long swoops. Anything you can do that adds forgiveness makes a highway safer. That concept was brought into town design. So you have engineers designing streets for forgiveness. What does that do? Think about how you set your speed when you're in a neighborhood. It's not, you don't even look for speed limit signs. There are all these cues. How wide is the street? Are there cars parked on it?
Right.
Are there potentially people crossing because of crosswalks and many intersections? Are there, buildings close to the street? Because your speed is a function of the environment and not a function of the speed that is set, anything you do to make a city more forgiving is causing death and injury because people are driving that difference. They're driving 35 instead of 25. Well, guess what? A car going.
Why we have young people driving Maseratis at 60 miles an hour in the streets of Los Angeles. Jeff, I'm loving the conversation. It's time for us to take a little break. We're going to take just a minute break here to hear from our sponsors. We'll be right back with Jeff Speck on the Futurists in a minute. Stay tuned. Hi, this is Rob Tercek from the Futurist podcast, which is part of the Provoked Media Network. I'm excited to tell you about some news. The Futurist is expanding into the real world. We're doing a live event in Dubai. Now, folks who listen to the Futurist podcast, you're going to be familiar with the fact that my co-host Brett King has been working very hard in Dubai and other parts of the Middle East for a long time. And for more than a year, he's been putting together this event. And now, with the help and support of MasterCard and Emirates MBD and many other partners, we are putting together the world's largest futurist meeting in Dubai. It will take place at the fabulous Jumeirah Beach Hotel in Dubai, and it'll be on the September 22nd and 23rd this year. So just a few weeks from now. The speakers are going to include some of the world's leading futurists and forecasters and future thinkers. People like Brian Cox and astronaut Scott Kelly. Of course, Brett and I will be there to conduct interviews and introduce some of the other folks. We've got speakers from around the world. And if you're interested in meeting futurists in person and participating in an event that attracts the future-minded, please join us on the 22nd and 23rd of September. You can learn more about it at futuristevent.com. That's futurist singular event.com. It's all one word, futuristevent.com. And that'll tell you all about the event. I sure hope to see you there in Dubai on the 22nd and 23rd of September. Thanks. Hey there, welcome back to The Futurist. I'm Rob Tercek, and this week I'm talking to an old college classmate who happens to be one of the leading thinkers about city planning and design and transportation policy. It's Jeff Speck, who is a principal and a partner and a founder of Speck Dempsey, which is a company that focuses on helping cities and towns plan and design the roadways, the walkways, and the bike lanes. We've been having a lively conversation here, and as we've been talking, it occurred to me that we need to talk about the most important invention of the 20th century. Now, think about that for a second, folks who are listening. I want you to consider, what do you think is the most important invention of the 20th century? And I'm sure some folks are going to say the smartphone, but of course that came much later. That came around 2007, the modern smartphone that we have. In the 20th century, there was an invention of the very earliest part of the century that utterly transformed not just the way our cities look and are shaped, but also our manufacturing process, the distribution of goods, the way we shop, the way retail is designed, and the way food is presented to us. I'm not joking. Of course, I'm talking about the automobile. And Henry Ford's industrial process assembly line transformed American manufacturing and taught us how to manufacture at scale. And that in turn gave us a consumer economy. Because he manufactured automobiles cheaply, it made it possible for the workers at the factory to purchase automobiles. So he created his own customers. And as a result, the automobile was taken up with a great deal of zest. Of course, there were cars before Henry Ford, before his time, but they were handmade, built in the style of a carriage maker. What he did was industrialize it, build it at scale, and those methodologies then percolated through all of our other manufacturing industries, and that turned America into a manufacturing powerhouse in the first part of the 20th century. It also changed our cities. because, of course, the very next thing that happened by the 1920s were traffic congestions and traffic problems. Very famously on Long Island, people would try to leave the city of Manhattan and they would get snarled on the old dirt roads. It's hard to imagine a time when American roadways outside of cities were dirt, but that was true until the middle part of the century in most of this country. So we began to do large-scale roadway planning. After World War II, President Eisenhower, who had been sent as early in his career, had been sent to prospect across the entire country and found American roads to be abysmal in the early 1910s. When he was president, started the National Highway Program, where the U.S. rebuilt the entire country, redesigned the entire country around these massive interstate highways that we have today. Those in turn reconfigured commerce because once you could get on a freeway and drive out of the city, you could shop at a big box store. You could live in a suburban home. And so people did this. People started to change their behavior. As Jeff said in the beginning part, as soon as you make it a possible, as soon as you afford the possibility, human behavior will change. As a result, fast forward to today, we live in a world defined by the automobile. Not just the way we drive or the way we get around town, but the way we consume and the way we build and the way we sell. All of that has been transformed by the car. Now, Jeff, that sounds like a very positive tale that I just told about the automobile, but I'm sure in your experience, there's a lot of negative aspects of that, right? So the automobile was originally presented as a kind of symbol of freedom, right? When we were young, if you were 16, you wanted to get your license and get a car and you could drive and you were free, right? But today I've noticed that my daughter and my nieces and nephews and their friends, none of them own cars. They're not interested in owning a car because a car, in a way, is like a ball and chain. You have to house it and feed it, right? You've got to pay for insurance. You got to pay for gasoline. You got to pay for a place to park it. If you live in a city, these are all negatives and they're quite expensive, right? If you live in a big city where the jobs are these days, having an automobile is like paying for a second apartment. So a lot of folks today are growing up rethinking the automobile as a symbol of freedom, and instead it's become a symbol of oppression for people. For younger people, it seems like they would love to find a way to live without automobiles. Jeff, is this part of your experience? Are you seeing this trend as well? You know, the advent of Ubers and now robot taxis, making it possible for people to have transportation as a service without necessarily owning a car.
Yes, and I'm very pleased to hear that about your family and the choices they're making. Certainly, younger people are less interested in, and this started a good decade ago, maybe more. Younger people are less interested in car ownership. Younger people are very aware and burdened by the costs of car ownership. The typical household in America is spending about $12,000 a year on their cars. That's twice what the typical Swiss family spends to get around those wonderful cities and countryside. We can get almost anywhere by transit. In addition to that 12,000, one study out of Harvard found that the typical family is paying another 14,000 in general taxation to support their own driving and to support everyone else's driving. So your daughter or your niece are actually paying taxes to drive, even though they're not driving. So that's a problem. You mentioned how the car has changed business, it's changed the economy, it's changed our country. It's also changed our bodies and it's changed our society. It's changed
Not in a
our
good way.
not in a good way. If you've seen Wall-E, and which is really about the car, and it's changed society. In terms of our bodies, you know, there's a wonderful book called Urban Sprawl and Public Health, where three epidemiologists set out to talk about the impacts on public health that have come from the automobile. And they say, you know, we have the first generation of American kids who are expected to live shorter lives than their parents. And it's because we've engineered out of society the useful walk. So it's calories in and calories out. Our diet sucks, but our activity also sucks.
Wow.
Right.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
then
That's terrible.
in terms of society, you know, you have to take this to its extreme. So we talked about zoning. We talked about these pods of different use. And lo and behold, here's a pod that's only $1 million homes. And here's a pod that's only $600,000 homes. And here's a pod that's only garden apartments. And guess what? Everyone who lives in that pod makes almost exactly the same income.
Mhm.
So there's a history in the US of us separating ourselves from each other based on ethnicity or, you know, how recently we arrived in this country. But now we're separating ourselves, and it's been this way for a generation. We've been separating ourselves by precise income into
Mhm.
these pods of people just like us, which is horrible for society. And there is a correlation, if I can get political, there is a correlation between this sort of homogeneous suburbanization and right-wing politics.
Interesting. It probably affects the entire spectrum, right? You can imagine that impact. But the divisions you're talking about are driven in part not just by the automobile, but something else that's related also to city planning, which is privatization.
Hmm.
So you and I have lived through a time where, when we were children, city governments manage most public services, but today, particularly where I live in California, there's a rising number of private communities, like you mentioned, where people can self-segregate. And if you can afford to live in that private community, oh, then you have private security and you have private swimming pools and private parks and so forth, and other people, the public, can't come in. This is a very strange trend because it tends to disassociate those homeowners from the city that they live in. They start to wonder, well, if I'm paying homeowners fees to be part of this association, why should I also pay taxes for everybody else? And so it creates an othering, right? So there's the idea that
Yep.
there's the people in our enclave and we all pay and we're all the same. And then there's all those other people out there and maybe they are different looking and maybe they're from different places or they speak with a different accent and they're different from us, right? And so this othering creates a division and actually creates an economic problem for cities because you have this anti-tax plan, and then you have the fans of privatization are less supportive of public initiatives. And you
Mhm.
mentioned the right-wing politics, and it is certainly true that the Koch brothers were principal players in driving this wedge into small communities across the country. They were firmly anti-public transportation. They did their best to derail light rail programs in cities that would have eased congestion and made it possible for people to travel across the city without a car. And so there is a political element to this. Now, I wasn't expecting to get into a right and left conversation. I think we can probably leave that there. But I think this idea that there's a growing and deepening divide in the United States, a polarization, if you will, and an inability to reconcile those differences, some of that does have to do with geography and the built environment that we live in. In other words, it's by design. Let's talk a little bit about the future and the walkable city. Do you think that might reverse this polarization? Is there any possibility of that when people rub elbows with their other, citizens in the town and they see people on the street and they walk past them and greet them? Is that something that might reverse this polarization?
It certainly would. The question is whether it will, in the sense that will we have success in achieving our mission as designers and planners, which is to make that walkable lifestyle available to more people. My goal used to be stopping sprawl, right? With my mentors, I wrote this book called Suburban Nation that described the distinction between town and, or I should say neighborhood and sprawl. And I think when I wrote that with them in the 90s, I really thought, this young bushy haired 30 something, for 30 in design, 30 something is young, person was like, "Hey, we can stop sprawl." But I no longer have that hope. I think the momentum behind sprawl and all the perverse incentives that cause sprawl to happen are just too strong. But I do think, and I have witnessed this trend. I think there's this trend towards making more walkable places and making our existing places more walkable. There's no doubt that there's a tremendous market mismatch between how many people want to live in walkable places and how many truly walkable places there are.
Yeah.
Whenever you build them, they are successful.
That's true. Like the planned
Uh,
communities in Florida, I know you've done
yeah.
one, and there are others. The Celebration, famously the Disney City. These are highly desirable places because of the walkability and I think the sociability that comes with it. It feels to people like some kind of iconic small town America from the past, from the mythic past, and that we'd like to recreate that in our present lives. And those who can afford it, they're going to opt into that system. What about the people who can't afford that?
Well, you made me think of something rather upsetting, which is that when we create new communities, we intentionally include a wide variety of housing.
Mhm.
So we have, in any community we will have mansions, we will have houses, we will have bungalows, we'll have row houses, apartments, condos. And the idea was that we would allow society to recoalesce again and have diversity. What tends to happen in these communities is that they become so valuable that even though you might have people of different ages and different places in life, they, if they're in the free market, they get bought up and up, and you don't see that sort of diversity. don't
Mhm.
see, you see all different households of wealthy people mostly.
Right.
and
So
and that's
large and small families living in they're
yeah.
all of a certain economic caliber.
But the fact is, though, that when we work in existing cities and just make them more walkable, uh, it, it, particularly around middle and lower income communities, that is something that benefits everyone there. And the main warning we give to cities where we work in is that you may need to take some measures to stem what is called gentrification. We call it displacement. You may need to take some measures to stem displacement because it took me so many years as a planner to realize that, and you got to take this in its entirety. It's my job to gentrify. And what I mean by that is it's my job to make places better. If you make them better, they become more valuable. If they become more valuable, the price
Mm-hmm.
goes up, property taxes go up, potentially, rents go up, and there's a risk of displacement. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's a hand in hand thing when you're doing planning to also communicate to cities that you need to put measures in place like land trusts and uh, income tax abatement, property tax abatement programs and other things, so that the benefits accrue to the existing citizens and they're not in a position where they have to leave.
Yeah, Jeff, this is all making me realize another thing I would love to ask you, but I'm going to pivot to a slightly different topic, but it's back on the theme of privatization. Um, a couple of years ago, someone mentioned to me in passing, we were talking about nations, I think because South Sudan had just split away from Sudan. And so there was a new nation. And it's not that often that a new nation is created, right? After the breakup of the Soviet Union, you saw a lot of new nations created. And I think today there are about 195 nations around the world. But we're not manufacturing too many nations anymore. Like that number doesn't change too much. It might change by one or two periodically. Um, but the person I was speaking to said, yes, but what you're missing is private places, privatized nations. And I was like, what are you talking about? Seasteading? Like, creating some floating community out on the ocean somewhere, some pirate island or something?
There are some of those.
He said, no, special economic zones. Special economic zones are growing at a rapid clip. And I did not really understand. And then when I investigated, I realized that at the time when you and I were in college, there were maybe a few hundred special economic zones. But then when China pivoted in the 1990s, the Chinese government got into this idea of special economic zones, beginning with Shenzhen in the south, which was just a fishing village near Hong Kong. They turned that into a special economic zone that was designed for private enterprise. Boom, it was a huge success. They since created 300 more. So China has a lot of special economic zones. But around the world today, there are estimated to be between 5,000 and 10,000 special economic zones. And these are zones, typically a private public partnership of some sort. Very rarely are they purely run by government. Sometimes they're entirely private. And by that definition, it means that they are like separate governments. These are places that are run differently, planned differently, managed differently, policed entirely differently. And the rights that you may have as a citizen a mile or two away may not apply when you're inside of that special economic zone. And so for some folks, this takes on a kind of Orwellian cast, big brother idea that you've privatized the function of a city. Now, I want to give you that as background and ask you to speculate a little bit about the future, because clearly this trend towards special economic zones is rolling with some momentum. It's not going to slow down. So, where we have maybe nearly 200 nations in the world, we now have thousands, some say 10,000 privatized nations, if you will, or privatized cities. Sometimes they're as small as a factory, sometimes they're just a seaport, sometimes they're a zone around a seaport or manufacturing center. But these do encompass living, and they do encompass all the other aspects of the neighborhood that you described. Now, do you see this as a positive trend? Do you see privatization as a negative trend, or is it not viewed that way? Is it just another economic opportunity that you have to attend to?
I would say it's part and parcel with the general disassociation of our society, both physically and on the web, right? In the other world, it's a negative trend. Have you read Snowpiercer? Any show about the future
Hmm.
needs to know Snowpiercer.
Hmm.
I finally read it. It's such an, I mean, because the entire world has become these special economic zones.
Yeah.
And it's fantastic how, I think that's the most, in your business,
It's a
Rob,
dark vision, right? It's not
yeah,
appealing.
Yeah, it's but I imagine your audience all knows this book. I just discovered it, and it really changed my life to read that incredible story about a vision of the future.
And one
I
of the
did
reasons
want
most
to,
people are unaware of special economic zones is because if you don't have permission to be there, if you're not employed, you can't be it, and you can,
yeah,
you drive around it, and it's almost invisible to you. And so these things are sprawling, and they're here in the United States. Make no mistake about it. We have them here, but they're very prevalent in the southern hemisphere. People tend to be unaware that they exist because you can't go in,
yeah.
you can't see them.
Can I say in the remaining time we have, I was thinking about the future
Great.
in preparation for this show, and there was kind of some things I wanted to talk with you about or hear your take on. Uh, but the a long time ago, I read this book you probably know by Neil Postman called Technopoly:
Yeah.
The Surrender of Culture to Technology.
Huge
Uh,
fan of Neil Postman and Marshall
yeah,
McLuhan. Huge fan.
yeah. Well, Neil Postman quotes Marshall McLuhan, and he talks about the technological imperative. And I'm curious about your take on the technological imperative, which is basically, um, the idea that any new technology that improves convenience will be adopted, whether its impacts on society or bad.
Mhm.
And the quote of Marshall McLuhan that I wrote down from that book is, "It's a great convenience to be able to call my cousin in Vancouver on the telephone or visit him by train, but it is only because of the telephone and the train that he lives in Vancouver." And I was curious because I do feel that you're very pro technology, pro future. You're you're maybe a cheerleader for change. You've always liked the next thing, right?
Mhm.
Do
Are you asking
you?
about me personally, or are you asking about this show or the general theme?
I'm just wondering. I'm just wondering if your embrace of the future and technology uh, is mitigated by concerns.
Sure thing. Okay, so the premise of this show is that my co-host Brett is an unabashed optimist about the future, and as he often will say, I can't wait till we live in that future. So he's looking forward to the future, and I share that optimism, but I frame it more as cautious optimism because I'm well aware of the downside risks, and I'm very interested in the unexpected secondary consequences. And by the way, I think I would say that. This is one of the major pitfalls of some futurists that are there. They get very focused on a particular idea or a particular trend or something new, the new shiny object, if you will, and they get very excited about that, and it sort of dominates their imagination, their consciousness. What they fail to see are the second order or third order consequences of that.
Mhm.
And the example I would give is artificial intelligence. And those who listen to the show, there's a number of recent episodes where we've gone deep into this topic, like what will the second and third order consequences of widespread adoption of AI be? I'm very much on the record of being pessimistic and skeptical. I'm skeptical about the euphoric claims, and there is a kind of tech fetishism. I don't think I have this, but there is a kind of like worship of the power of technology, right? Almost religious. And you see these sort of weird techno religious impulses like, the singularity and long termism and so forth. These are outshoots of, what Kant would call the transcendent impulse in humans. If you work in the technology industry, you might think of yourself as an atheist or someone who doesn't adopt mainstream religions or organized religion, but yet you still have that transcendent impulse and you tend to apply it to technology, and
Exactly.
we end up worshiping the machine. Now, this is very dangerous because one of the principles of Marshall McLuhan, who I adore and like, and I still read, and I think it's still incredibly relevant 50 years later, um, one of his principal ideas is that the tools shape us, right? We shape the tools, then the tools shape us. And I would go further and say we use the tools and then the tools use us. And the whole dialogue we just had about the automobile is a great example, right? We wanted a way to replace the horse and buggy with something faster that we could control and where you didn't have to feed it hay and, hoof it and so forth. Okay, so we built the automobile. Great. And 100 years later, we're beset with a number of problems, including obesity. Who would have ever expected that, right? These are examples of second and third order consequences. I think if we worship technology blindly and just embrace it and maybe in some ways celebrate it so much that we blind ourselves to the consequences, we risk creating a world we never intended. This is the downside risk. This takes me right back to what Andrew Hessel said to me, that what I was talking about at the very beginning of the show. there's a perspective that we have godlike powers. Technology affords us godlike powers to control and design the world around us. And we'd better start getting serious about that, and we'd better get good at it. We might as well start getting good at it. I think we could say that our generation hasn't done such a great job as stewards of the planet. I think that's recorded in the environmental record. And so we're going to have to deal with those consequences, or our children and their children will live with them. So now it's time for us, I think, to develop a better awareness. And my personal feeling is, yes, it's fine to be optimistic, but bring a measure of caution and be thoughtful about the consequences that come with rapid change.
Well, if I could, and bring it back to cities, which is ostensibly our subject. The very first futurist I knew about was John Nesbitt. Do you
Yeah,
remember
I very much.
Megatrends?
Yeah.
I actually met him in Saudi working on a project
Oh,
many
cool. You actually met him. Oh,
thousands,
wow. Yeah.
yeah, many years ago. Um, and he had this concept of high tech, high touch.
Yes.
And I believe one of your titles for the show was something like the city uh, and dematerialization or immaterial. What is the term you use?
And I use vaporization, and that's the book that I wrote. And that
Yeah,
is 100% focused on replacing physical stuff with software.
yeah. And I think there's a relationship between that thinking and his thinking and the high tech, high touch, where it's on steroids now, right? And as the world becomes more and more virtual, and as things become less and less real, we as humans really need that high touch, and we need community, and we need place.
That's right.
We
For those who are
inhabit.
listening, let me put a little color on this. So, for those who are listening, John Nesbitt is a futurist from the late 70s and early 1980s who wrote about technology trends. Um, and his concept of high tech and high touch that Jeff's referring to now, he said, as we adopt high technology, we must, as humans, we must also increase the humanity. We must increase the touch points for humanity. If we lose that and we're dominated by technology, it makes us less human. Please continue. I didn't mean to bust in there, but I wanted to give that context.
Well, it's just the fact that we're animals, right? And there's so much more to how we relate to each other than just what can be conveyed virtually or even in a Zoom call. There was a study done, it was before Zoom, but I think it was at Wharton, where they had groups that met in person, they had groups that met over the internet. And of course, they were not of course, but they were given challenges, intellectual problems to solve. And the physical groups ran circles around the groups that were meeting virtually. I read somewhere that the first thing many people do when they shake hands, is find a way to smell their own hand.
Oh, that
And the
yeah, for
point
animals.
being that we are Jonathan Haidt talks about this. I think it's him who talks about how we're a chimpanzee riding an elephant, that we've got the front of our brain that we think is in charge, that's making all these decisions, when in fact all we're really doing is rationalizing decisions that our brainstem, our prehistoric brain, has already made for us. And so how a person smells, right? How you feel when you're in their presence, what it means to be in a pub full of strangers as opposed to a chat room. These things are beyond our comprehension. They're outside our control. And it requires the kind of city that we actually can't invent. So I mentioned that I ran into Nesbitt in Saudi. We were in some of the early ideation workshops for this new town called Neom, that
Oh
you've
my
probably
goodness.
heard of.
Yes.
I'm
Talk
no
about
longer
city
involved with
planning.
Neom. It's become the line. The line is a 100-kilometer slice of a building, 60 stories high, intended to stretch from the ocean to the mountains, or the sea to the mountains in Saudi. As far as I can tell now, the principal urban design challenge that project tried to meet was to be visible from space. But the criticism I have of that plan, there are a lot of design criticisms I have, and they've interviewed me several times about what my concerns are. And they're very open to criticism, I should
Hmm.
say. But the principal one is that cities contain a wisdom that we do not fully understand. They have a spooky logic that resolves from the fact that cities evolved naturally alongside humans, with humans, and that the best cities were not invented. They were just evolution of the places where we were, most comfortable living. The idea that a committee or even a single person could ever reinvent a city that would be better than this almost natural thing that we've inherited is preposterous. And the quote that you started the show with actually troubled me a bit because it suggested that there was design behind absolutely everything. Well, I was design director at the NEA for 4 years. I was supposedly the principal federal advocate for design. And I got to say, that's bad. There's we've got to understand that that there are parts of the world, I hope still, that aren't designed, that shouldn't be designed, but also that sure, everywhere where man is touching or humans are touching, there's a design component, but we may not understand what that design component is. It may be something that happened more naturally.
It's terrible. It's like terrible conceit, right? We think we're designing, and
Yeah.
what we're really doing is bungling,
Yeah.
making
So
making these mistakes. Oh gosh, Jeff, it's been a great pleasure having you on the Futurists. Thanks so much for sharing your wisdom with our fans. I'm really happy to have you here. Great to reconnect with you after so many years. Folks, you've been listening to the Futurists with our guest Jeff Speck. And Jeff, tell us where people can find you on the web. Where can they learn more about you and your books?
well, I would really encourage the gateway drug. It's been described for people who are interested in urbanism is the book Walkable City. So I would direct people there. But that resource and many others, including 2 popular TED Talks, they're all findable at our website, which is Speck Dempsey, Dempsey like the boxer, speckdempsey.com, which is our design firm based in Boston. That's a great place for people to start.
Great. Thank you for joining us. And folks, thanks for listening. I love to hear from our fans. I love to hear from the listeners. So if you have thoughts or suggestions for speakers or questions you'd like us to ask, please do send those to us. If anyone can join us at the event in Dubai on the 22nd and 23rd of September, we'd be thrilled to see you there in person. I've already heard from some folks who are planning to come, so that's exciting news as well. And of course, next week, Brett and I will be back with another person who is thinking about and designing and influencing the future that they envision. Until then, we'll see you in the future.